Welcome to this episode of Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Cader. In today's show, I'm pleased to be joined by former World Trade Organization Director General Pascal Lamy. Today, we will be discussing all things international trade and WTO. Mr. Pascal Lamy served 2 terms as Director General of the WTO from September 2005 to September 2013. Before becoming Director General, he had an extensive and distinguished career in Paris and Brussels, including as advisor to Finance Minister and the Prime Minister of France, before working as Chief of Staff to EU Commission President Jacques Delores. Throughout his career, he has proven his commitment to the vision of globalization through several publications. He is on the board of the Jacques Delores Institute and currently president of the Paris Peace Forum. Mr. Lamy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, Mr. Lamy, starting off a general overarching question, can you explain to our audience the importance of WTO to global affairs?
Well, I believe WTO matters to global affairs because economic development matters for people overall on this planet, and that the expansion of international trade is a contribution to economic development, not the only contribution, but a major contribution as international exchange increases the efficiency of your economy. And if you increase the efficiency of your economy, you create growth. Now, this, of course, does not happen under any conditions. There has to be proper conditions so that the expansion of international trade contributes to economic development, and these conditions necessitate a global consensus, which translates into rules, which are in the hands of a specialized international organization, where these rules are decided by the members and implemented according a series of procedures that make sure that once rules are agreed, the rules of the game of international trade, then they are followed by those who have agreed them.
And something else I kind of wanted to touch upon is this connection between trade and peace. Now, I know this notion goes back centuries ago. It was embodied in the post-war Marshall Plan. However, many people today are not as aware of the connection. Can you please elaborate more on the connection between trade and global peace?
Well, I mean, if you look at human history, overall, there is a sort of law that where trade flows, armies do not flow. Now, there are exceptions to this principle, which I think history tells us is overall true. Trading with people brings economic development, which is one of the conditions for peace. If you agree that lots of conflicts have at their source poverty, uneasiness, miscontentment, inequalities. So growing an economy is a contribution to peace, plus the fact that, and we've known that forever, starting with, for instance, the islands in the Mediterranean at the Greek period, or later the exchanges between Europe and China, that connecting people through trade is also connecting cultures and knowledge, which I think is also a contribution to peace. Now, this has not always been true, but overall it is true.
On the note of WTO reform, the organization has been badly impacted through the challenges of its dispute settlement mechanism. How can this issue be overcome?
Well, it's obviously a serious issue because compared to other international organizations, the WTO has a sort of a super efficiency. It is more efficient in implementing the rules that are decided globally, notably thanks to a very specific dispute settlement system, which, contrary to normal international law, obliges the losing party to abide with a judicial decision at the end of a process of dispute settlement. for a variety of reasons, the Trump administration has decided to boycott and to freeze this dispute settlement system, at least, if not at the level of first instance, at the level of appeal. This is a serious problem. I'm convinced that if the Biden administration really wants to re-engage with the World Trade Organization, and we've got some signals in this direction, but they still have to walk the talk. This is a problem that can be solved so that the WTO recovers its litigation comparative advantage.
Also, on the note of reform, you've also stated in the past about it needing to be a less member-driven organization and more secretariat-driven and an institution rather than an organization. Could you just explain to us why?
Well, it's a point I've tried to make for some time, having been both on the deck and in the machine room of the organization as Director General. If you ask an average diplomat about how WTO should be run, he or she will tell you it is a member-driven organization. I'll tell you a small anecdote. When I became DG of WTO, I was offered a very nice caricature by an Australian, a former WTO Deputy Director General of the name of Andrew Stoller, and I do respect this guy. And he's a very good cartoonist, and he offered me a cartoon where you have a tree, a car, and the car has crashed into the tree. And the legend of the cartoon is a member-driven car. Now, I think this says why an only member-driven organization cannot work efficiently. I think you need a sort of third trust party with good people, good experts, objective people, which is what the WTO Secretariat is, and I know them, I work with them, they are very good quality, but they should be given a higher role in, for instance, tabling proposals when there is a problem. The fact that today, tabling proposals for negotiations or for changes in the rule book is a monopoly of the members, I think is a mistake. And if you look at how other international organizations work, this is a sort of exception which should be addressed at the WTO.
Given the recent global political climate over the past few years, there would be some who countered this argument by saying that this move would be less democratic. What would your sort of response to that be?
Well, that's a general problem in a international system that in theory works with roughly 200 sovereign nation states who are sovereign, which means that they only or not accept to enter into institutions, rules, obligations. I believe this sort of legal, juridical principle of sovereignty does not fit with today's world, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why we created the Paris Peace Forum a few years ago, because we believe that international cooperation should not be left in the hands of diplomats, of sovereigns, but should expand to NGOs, big business coalitions, cities, major academic institutions, while recognizing that in terms of legitimacy, sovereigns are the ones who decide with their population who should govern them. International institutions are not per se democratic. They are the product of agreement between sovereigns, some of which are democratic, others are not. And as we all know, democracy is not something which is mathematically transitive. We have to accept in a world which needs more global cooperation, we have to accept that the participants to this global cooperation will be partly democracies, partly non-democracies. I'm a Democrat. I believe that democracy is the best form of government, but I know full well that on this planet, this view is not 100% shared.
Thank you for those points. Very interesting. Sort of moving closer to Australia, the we recently had tensions with trade with China. The U.S. China trade issues have been impacting Australia. What advice would you give to Australia in regards to dealing with this issue?
Well, I mean, I would advise Australia to keep doing what it has been doing for the last 40 years, which is try to strengthen a rules-based multilateral system. The recent skirmishes, incidents, conflicts on trade between China and Australia are a very good case that when you've got a huge economy like China and a middle-sized economy like Australia, if you want the rule of force to prevail, Australia will suffer. So we need a system where the rule of force, which is what the Chinese have been doing with Australia for various reasons, which are more geopolitical than geoeconomic, we need a system where the rule of force is mitigated by rules that rebalance the game of powers within the trading system. What Australia should do is what it does, which is try to strengthen the WTO, and that's a long-term goal, and what they've been doing, which is taking China to the dispute resolution in the WTO, betting on the fact that while the US have not participated in the dispute settlement at appellate body level for the moment, there is a patch which was put in place by the Europeans, which allow disputes such as the one between Australia and China to be duly processed at the WTO. So strengthen the rule, and if they are breached, take the country to the WTO litigation system.
And on another topic close to home is the issue of climate change and the connection between climate change and trade. What are your thoughts on this connection and the role of carbon tariffs and what role WTO should be playing in this?
Well, I'm of the view that we need to review, to relook at how international trade can foster, benefit environment protection, whether climate change, biodiversity, or a host of other issues. I have written on this several pieces which you can find on the site of Europe Jacques Delors in oneworld.eu. There's a series of briefs about how I and my co-author, who's the one that is the Director General of this think tank, which is the third Jacques Delors think tank after Paris and Berlin, it's in Brussels, we've written abundantly on how to green international trade. There are a series of measures that need to be taken to make sure that the balance of contribution of expansion of international trade to environment protection is reviewed, notably, for instance, because on the one side, if you grow the efficiencies of the economies, this is also true in their consumption of natural resources. So there is a benefit in increasing the consumption of natural resources through international division of labor, which is a thesis which many economists will sustain. On the other side, if you trade on highly carbon intensive products, or if international trade leads to transport that, for instance, increases carbon emission, you have a problem. We know the solution in theory. The solution in theory is to have a common global worldwide high carbon price. We know that this is not, unfortunately, for tomorrow. And in the meantime, you need systems that address the discrepancies between carbon pricing. The price of carbon in Europe was, I think yesterday, 62 euros a ton. The average worldwide must be around 10 euros. There is a serious problem if you want to really decarbonize your economy through carbon pricing, hence the necessity of adjustments such as the planned EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. No doubt, WTO will have to be involved in deciding the conditions under which such measures, which may be trade restrictive for the sake of avoiding carbon leakage to moving production to places where the price of carbon is lower. This is an issue which I'm sure is going to have quite a large attention in the WTO in the times to come.
Thank you. Now moving more to the impact of COVID on international trade. I was listening to your interview with the Lowy Institute here in Australia and found a very interesting point you made is that you highlighted that the recovery will be complicated by precautionism, meaning that governments protecting people from the risk rather than protectionism. Can you just elaborate more on this point to our audience?
Well, if we start from the basics, expanding international trade, which leads to better economic development under some conditions, basically means reducing obstacles to trade. In today's world, you have two categories of obstacles to trade, some of which have as a purpose to protect producers from foreign competition. This is what I call protectionism. You protect your producers from foreign competition. Others have as a purpose to protect your people from risks in the areas of food safety, safety of devices, environment protection, which I call precaution, hence this notion of precautionism as opposed to protectionism. Protectionism is something which is relatively simple to deal with. If it's about tariffs on carrots or pears or shirts or shoes, not a big ideological problem. Precautionism is much more complex because addressing risk management, if it's about safety, if it's about aflatoxin in nuts or pesticide in flowers, or the quality of meat, or the safety of lighters, or the safety of cars, this is something which is much less objective, which was much more connotated to cultures, to history, to symbolic mental representations, to something of a scale between good and bad. And we know that we don't really have a scale between good and bad if it's about shirts or bicycles. We have a scale between good and bad when it's about health or where it's about environment. So my view is that we not only have to deal with the classical issues of protectionism, obstacle to trade such as tariffs or subsidies that have as a purpose to facilitate your producers as opposed to foreign producers, but to issues that have to do with regulation, with norms, with standards, with certification. And this is, of course, a much more complex issue. And I think we have to look at the future of dealing with obstacle to trade with things which are more complex, more legitimate. I believe that it's perfectly legitimate for a country to decide that the lighters it imports should not be a danger for kids. Now, we don't have an international organization that decides what is the real standard of lighters which are not dangerous for kids. We need something of this kind. There is something like the ISO, for instance, that can transform into a more global standard setting. But I think opening trade in the future will need more global standard setting than what we have today.
Moving on to another point in which how to deal with COVID, that COVID's changed the role of technology. I know you've spoken about the acceleration of the digitalization of economies. What impact do you think this has on the digital divide, and who do you think are the winners and the losers in this?
No, I think, COVID has had a sort of short-term impact on international trade, notably at the beginning, when many countries realized that they were relying a lot on international trade for providing either medicines or equipment. And this has led to a global conversation according to which these big supply chains might be fragile, that they should be made more resilient. And think there is, in some cases, there is a reality in this. I think now that we've looked at the number, the reality is that most fundamental supply chains, energy, food, have properly resisted the COVID shock, which has had a huge impact on the economy because of lockdowns more than because of deficiencies in international trade. Yet, I think COVID will have once accelerated this move to looking more at precaution, which is what we just discussed, and has also projected this world 5 or 10 years ahead in digitalization. And we know that digitalization is a major change in our economies, and that the speed of digitalization, a bit like what happened in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, will lead to social changes which need to be properly addressed. Otherwise, global market capitalism left at itself will produce what it usually produces when it's left at itself, which is more inequalities in the name of more efficiencies and more competition. I believe that we need competition, but I also believe that, for instance, the digital transition needs to be globally and domestically addressed so that the weaker in the population are not hit even more than what they are today.
And as we approach time, moving into our last question, this ties into your new book, Strange New World, Geoeconomics versus Geopolitics, which I kind of found the topic quite fascinating. Can you explain us briefly what the link is between these two concepts?
Well, I think, geoeconomics and geopolitics are what frames international conversation, international cooperation, treaties, institutions, the purpose of which is to address together global challenges. And I think we've lived through around the years 2000, we've lived in a world where the hope was that geoeconomics, which usually lead to more peace, were trumping geopolitics, which usually lead to conflict. With a very simple representation, because we don't have time to retail all this, that geoeconomics is about rationality and geopolitics is about emotions. I think there was a period where the hope that geoeconomics would mitigate geopolitics, thus lead to a more peaceful world, was the dominant view, the dominant hope. Unfortunately, I think we are now, and this basically finds its origin in the 2008 financial crisis and in the rebalancing of power between China and the US in this planet. We are back to a period where geopolitics might trump geoeconomics, which I think in many ways is a danger, and we need to get this balance right. We have a very good example with COVID of the formidable benefits of globalization and geoeconomics in science. We found the vaccine or 200 vaccines in 1 year, which was totally implausible according to the best scientific experts a year ago. But we are pretty bad at making sure that this is properly distributed around the world. We have a formidable scientific success, and we are making a mess of how it is distribution, and this vaccine apartheid, which we now have on this planet, is in itself a major contribution to further divisions. So I believe we have to make sure that geoeconomics keep influencing geopolitics, which may lead to conflict, tensions, sometimes wars. This is the view I have of how do you deal with this complex balancing between the rationality of geoeconomics and the irrationality of geopolitics.
Mr. Lamy, thank you so much for participating in this interview. It's very insightful and we appreciate you being on.